And we should have Clear rejoining here in a second to introduce himself. Sorry to everybody for the slow start. We're just brushing off the dust. It's been a while since we've done a talk like this, so we're still trying to get used to running things again. Hopefully, once we get all the mic issues and stuff like that worked out, will be a lot easier for us to roll through this.
I think we'll wait on Clear to get his stuff set up. Sort of, we came up with the idea of doing this talk after sort of having a bunch of different interesting discussions with people about, you know, what what the tariffs were doing or what the markets were doing in response to them, and kind of how that all played out, just because of how unusual the tariffs were as a set of policy. I mean, I was talking to someone earlier today, and going through, okay, how do things like financial institutions and hedge funds and places like that look through the tariffs and figure out, like, okay, what do we think will happen with this? Like, how do you treat it? And you have to go back to the 20s and 30s to find academic work for how are we going to what the effects of this might be, or what a given set of equities or industries or different market conditions might do in response to it. And I know on like the regulatory side, you see, there's certain things going back 100 years where you can actually chase that down, but generally speaking, none of that stuff has a lot of language around it.
I mean, from my perspective, in the near short term, the most probably analogous thing to what we're about to experience was probably the opening months of COVID, when global trade really slowed down and stopped. And I suspect we'll see some of those same supply chain disruptions occur again, especially at the consumer level.
Yeah,
In
and
that way, Fred,
no, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things that was really unique about COVID was how, like, all that stuff turned off basically for months, and then things picked up. But, in this case, you have Trump seeming to feel very, very strongly about tariffs, no matter what else comes up.
Yeah, and I mean, and this is something that as much wishy-washiness as there is with Trump and with his administration. He's been, I mean, he has been wishy-washy about the implementation of this. We look going back over the past couple months with Canada and Mexico, the tariffs there. It was starting with some on again, off again, on again, off again, but which does not help market confidence by any means. And I think that even if the tariffs are lifted in the short term, there's been people speculating about, oh, well, this might only last a couple of weeks, or something like that. Even if that was the case, we see these just waves in what Trump and his administration have been doing, and I don't think that the tariffs being removed would help um, necessarily,
It's the uncertainty
but
that he's willing
that
to do it.
yeah, but across the board though, this has been something that he's been talking about consistently. I mean, he's on again, off again about actually implementing the tariffs and pausing them and things like that. But the administration's messaging that we're going to do tariffs, this is our um, economic tool. Uh, this is how we want to raise revenue. Um, that messaging has been very consistent. Uh, and I think the markets were surprised in some ways after the tariff announcement. I mean, it was in many ways worse than what markets were expecting. J.P. Morgan said that there will be blood. Other other firms on the street have had similar outlooks that this is not what was being expected. But nevertheless, I think that there had previously been some uncertainty that these tariffs would ever happen. Um, and the markets are trying to react to that. And
Well, and Trump
yeah,
very much, uses extreme messaging and things to try and generally get to a smaller outcome. With this, it's something where he's talked about the way, say, Japan used tariffs in the 80s to, have this massive sort of economic boom. And, I think part of what makes people have a lot of trouble with this is that you can't, sane countries don't do this. So no one studied exactly how this kind of thing plays out in a fully developed country.
Yeah, and I mean, ban banana bowl. God, sorry, I'm gonna butcher that name. He does have a good point. They haven't been lifted on Mexico and Canada. They've just been really delayed. The dates
yeah,
keep being pushed back on them. They're still on the table. I can still go and find them in HTS if I'm gonna go take a look.
All of the
yeah,
harm that generally comes from this still exists, whether they happen or not. It's the uncertainty that they introduce. Um, working with oil and gas companies, it's okay. If we're going to have, say, pipe shipped from Vietnam or wherever we're getting it from, companies are doing things like, well, let's have the ship with all the pipe just kind of go in circles for a week and then come in a little bit later. And it's all of the costs associated with doing that way.
I imagine the cost
Yeah,
on that ship doing circles, burning minimal fuel just to keep the power on there. It's probably cheaper than the 25-50% tariff that they're looking at right now.
right, exactly. That's then a ship that's not doing, whatever else it was going to do. And it's interesting to see this set of policies and the threat of this set of policies where, if you follow like a efficient market hypothesis and all that sort of stuff, you would never do this. And so all of these different companies and financial institutions, all these places, I don't think they appreciated that it was possible to do.
yeah. I mean, and there's questions about just rationality, and one of the important things to remember is like, yeah, like we haven't. If you look for research on issues like this, there's really not anything recent out there because we haven't seen anything like this um, in almost a century that um trying to remember if this is like the second or the third highest tariff rates. It's above that of Smoot-Hawley even for some countries, and so just what the economic implications of that are, nobody's
Like our
had time to really dive into this. A
or even
lot of this
spent
is
time on
Wi-Fi.
considering what it is. It
Yeah,
predates both, you know, Keyes and the Chicago School even really developing that set of economic thought. So you don't have any, in the financial industry, it means that there's not even like a ideological framework to think about this in. It's just like, well, everything exploded, so um, there's a chart. I'm gonna see if I can find it. That's the implied volatility in gold and crude oil right now are just insane. They just look like fireworks.
Fireworks.
You don't have any nice curve to them.
I will also say one of the more interesting things here, especially from like an economic development perspective and from a manufacturing perspective, is the uncertainty right now around how long these are going to last makes it very hard to plan for capital expenditure to grow a manufacturing base here in the if you weren't already planning on expanding, now's probably not the time because now your materials you need to build this facility are going to be tariffed and you're going to see 25-50% cost increase just on some of your tooling that you're going to probably need.
Yep.
But and
You're
your
Yeah,
cost
and
of
then
capital is incredibly high.
Yes.
yeah, and then you marry that with other uh, administration policies. I mean, the Trump administration has been, as we all know, incredibly hardline about immigration, and construction being a sector that um, relies on plenty of migrant labor. Um, that can stress things. Even if we're talking heavy construction, um, where you may have less migrant labor, I think that across the industry, when it starts to trickle down, that you have less workers available, that it
Right.
has
They all
impacts
become more
across. Yeah,
expensive.
and
The
so then you're so of course your um, capital costs for materials go up, but your human capital costs are also skyrocketing, and it just becomes untenable to be able to build out this sort of manufacturing that the administration is
I mean,
demanding.
I mean,
what they seem to be talking about there, goes back to sort of the way Japan developed in the 70s and 80s, where that was driven also by having a large amount of unproductive labor that, as it stands today in the US, we just don't have.
I will also say, SCLAN, you called out Clinton and NAFTA. I will say where I am based, so I'm kind of around Virginia, more Appalachia area. Um, that really was the death knell for a lot of manufacturing we had here up the 81 corridor around that time period. That's when we saw a lot of stuff take off initially for Mexico or Canada or China, and ultimately it never came back. And there's a lot of communities around here that have since had to shift their industry since then. But just because that happened so long ago that a lot of those people, like 30 years ago, the skills are gone. We still have to rebuild those skills again. We can't just open it up overnight and just put a new manufacturing facility in those communities.
I mean, oil and gas, where I generally work, is one of the more flexible industries for labor where you can just sort of like start and stop projects. And, what it pays to do that is you're sort of unskilled, like field labor personnel cost you $120,000 to $150,000 a year a person, and you have to pay that much, or people won't deal with how uncertain and risky that work can be. And I just don't see how American manufacturers could possibly pay that much and make the items the administration seems to want them to make, like t-shirts.
No, there's a whole
Well,
like even if you're just thinking about like let's bring manufacturing back. I mean, yeah, you keep hearing we've got factories ready to go, but if you look at the broader market, as far as like the economy, you're seeing every step of the way has to get rebuilt. You got to figure out, can I even do this domestically? And if I can't, can I weather the tariffs until I can? And I just don't think there was a lot of thought. I mean, it feels like a lot of this blindsided even the people on the Trump side's economics, that they just went to 100 right away, and that has unsettled a lot of people, because you want people to kind of ramp up this production domestically, and where each step of the supply chain kind of gets moved to the domestic market. That was like what I see as like the plan a lot of them had. But now it just feels like we're just trying to turn I mentioned in markets earlier, just trying to turn the heat up on everything without any regard to what the economic effects would be.
The thing is,
I mean, seems to fit with the way Trump implements policy.
but
He is not a subtle man.
Or anything that takes a little bit longer lead time. If you didn't start doing this the day he got elected, to pivot to a place to be ready for this, now it's too late. You're not going to be able to really do this without major capital expenditure.
Yeah, and some of these timelines, if you look at parts of the supply chain you're talking about, unless you literally saw him coming down the pipeline and you were like, oh, we got to do it now, and you took the investment like 2 years ago, you're behind. You're way behind, even if you started when he got elected.
Well, and if you did that and this doesn't happen, your competitors destroy you.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's
Everyone who
there's no
didn't do this,
stability.
you tie up a whole bunch of capital building a factory because you go, okay, I think Trump's going to be reelected and I think he's going to do this tariff thing. You need him to win, then you need him to do the tariff thing, and then he has to keep doing it for years for that factory to pay off.
I don't know if it's going to be some of these groups. I honestly think, because at the end of the day, the factory's still going to be able to raise costs and increase their revenue and profit margins while still being able to undercut the competition that didn't plan. They might possibly be able to see it get paid back. Not within a year, but probably before the end of this administration.
I mean, so normally when you're financing like a big capital intensive project like that, you're looking at your cost of capital being about 10% a year. And sort of your hope when you do that project is that the value of that factory with that cost of capital is positive at the end of 10 or 15 years. And so it's very hard with the way sort of the political system works for you to make those kinds of decisions based on the political environment. You're going to have two or three administrations that come and go while you're running the factory to pay off the capital that you borrowed to build it. I don't think it was realistic for the administration, even if someone, say, during the first Trump term had gone, I think he's going to do this tariff thing or this great idea or whatever it is, you still wouldn't really be in a position to deal with this because Trump's only there for 4 years. So you have to believe that not only does this happen, but it continues, and that whatever administration follows Trump also has this sort of, let's call it, unorthodox belief on trade. So do you guys want to take a couple of questions from people in chat?
Yeah, I
already
think we
been
can. We
fielding
can.
some of the statements. I was going to say real quick,
Yeah.
Monarch is a mod. You're right about the low cost or labor intensive goods. Even in the U.S., an assembly, someone that's working in an assembly position on the manufacturing line is probably 10 to 20 times the cost of their European counterpart. And you're ultimately going to want to try to find ways to automate that, because you're going to raise your costs on those low cost goods significantly.
I mean, you pretty much
Yeah.
have to go to automation where you can there. I mean, it was, the thing I talked about. We're in oil and gas to keep sort of uneducated manufacturing labor, where they're mostly using welding equipment and things like that. You're paying at least $120,000 a year, and that's where it starts. Like, that would be a 19-year-old with a felony conviction and 2 DUIs, so someone's got to drive him to the rig.
I think one of the issues here, Astor, you're talking about capital costs and repaying that, and just the borrowing costs associated with that, and the economic uncertainty that we're walking into. On one hand, we expect inflation to tick up due to the tariffs, and historically, the Fed has responded to increasing inflation by hiking rates, and but in contrast, if you get into a recession, you typically cut rates, and that gets us into this sticky spot about how does the Fed respond to rates. I mean, already we have Powell's comments a couple days ago that and he's really trying to play a very middle of the road approach, but within what he's saying, I interpret it as don't expect any rate cuts this year, even though we were typically expecting 1 to 2 cuts this year. Probably that's out the window. But just over time, how does that affect? If you are trying to bring your manufacturing back to the U.S., how does that impact your borrowing costs and what it takes to pay that off?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things Powell's brought up in the past is essentially that the job of the Fed is not to fix bad policy. That if there's an incredibly inflationary government policy, the Fed has to hike rates into it because that's the main driver of what they're doing. One of the things people are talking about a lot on chat is the different sources that exist for labor. Whether that's RFK's ADHD camps, which could be the most fun or worst place on earth depending on who runs them, or things like prison labor and those sorts of things. I think one of the things the administration may not fully appreciate is the scale of the labor problem we're talking about. That internationally, to feed sort of US consumer consumption, you have something like 200 to 300 million people who are employed doing that. And so you need, whenever we talk about different ways the administration might try to address it, you want to keep in mind the scale of that idea. That, coming up with 2 or 3 million felons gets you maybe 1% of the labor you're trying to get.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a comment here a few minutes ago from AlphaQ. They said, I think one thing people don't realize is that even many U.S. manufactured goods not dependent on trade will increase in price simply because they can raise their rate of profit while staying price competitive. And I mean, one of the anecdotes I keep going back to is, in a similar vein, because this does involve trade. But looking at cars, I bought a new car back at the beginning of the year, and it's a Subaru. My trim level is made in Indiana, and certainly it uses Japanese made parts, and so that will be impacted uh, by the tariffs. But if we were just looking at an even playing field and disregarding the parts uh, tariffs involved with that, um, the next trim level down is built in Japan. And so if you have one trim level, the cheaper trim level being built in Japan and it's being tariffed, 25%, and you have a trim level built in the US that's higher, typically more expensive, that uh, doesn't have, let's assume it doesn't have that tariff rate on it, then all of a sudden you're going to end up in a world where it's theoretically cheaper
All of your
to
pricing doesn't
you know it,
work.
yeah so yeah your pricing doesn't work, so you're going to have to raise uh prices across the board, even for your item that isn't theoretically being tariffed or isn't subject to tariffs to the same extent. And so it's not an even playing field even for goods that are manufactured in the US. And so whether your goods are 100% US manufactured, you don't have any tariff implication whatsoever. And all of a sudden you can now raise your prices because you can you're factoring in
You can.
all of that. Or if you have to raise your prices because you have goods that are made outside the US that are at a lower tier, but all of a sudden they cost more than your higher tier goods, well, you're going to raise your prices on your higher tier goods too.
I mean,
And
that
for
gets
me
you to the
being, I was just going to say quickly, for me being, of the mind that markets are broadly efficient and that sort of thing, it's also that, okay, they raise their prices and everyone else raises their prices beneath them. If your auto manufacturer raises its prices 20% because it can, then the American suppliers to that auto manufacturer do the same thing. Its workers do that, and everyone does that. That sort of inflationary tendency that exists goes sort of all the way down that chain.
Yeah.
REI. I'm going to get back to that one after Clear speaks.
sorry, I just got a phone call. The
I did notice we're all much more polite when there's a big audience. Generally, we're interrupting each other more and sweary.
oh, very much so. Somebody's recording this, so that's part of why I am. So the big thing to me, I was literally walking through and we were doing our grocery shopping and kind of, in anticipation of all this chaos, kind of going, what's stuff that can just sit on a shelf for a couple months? We're looking at all the stuff that's getting imported, and I had the same thought, thinking, oh, we buy like California olive oil, but then I was sitting there and I was going, oh no, that's going to go up because it's going to be the only thing there, and then what does that production look like, and how constrained is that going to be? It can't ramp up. Like, a lot of this stuff can't ramp up quickly either. So you're going to have that kind of lull where we're all going to be paying higher, and then does that higher price stick? That's to be seen.
Well, and in a way, it has to, because you don't have, even if you get rid of the tariffs 6 months later, your, say, olive oil manufacturer has already had to raise the wages of its staff and do all these different things to try and expand in an environment where you just don't have, it's not as though the US has like massive unemployment or something where you have these, the sort of waiting pool of labor and people trying to, do something productive. Every job that goes into, I don't know, making pots and pans, sewing heads on stuffed bunnies, or making olive oil, that person isn't doing whatever they were doing before. And generally, in a country like the United States, that means that they're going to be going from a more productive activity to a less productive one.
Yeah, and we already have this year a chilling effect on cheap labor that our economy's relied on for years. Whether or not
There is
the moral part of that. But go ahead.
Well, to say that there is the version of this kind of policy where you implement a lot of protectionist measures while at the same time going to really open immigration policy. And the idea being, okay, you want to build these things in your country instead of, and with the people who come with them, instead of them being, built somewhere else.
Yeah, that's not the reality we seem to be facing from a policy perspective.
It's pretty much a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
I mean, one thing, I think it's HCM in chat, kind of asked about is, is it too late to get manufacturing back? And I think, when you look at that, at least on the financial industry side, it's, manufacturing in developed countries is difficult to do. Developed countries tend to have, higher costs of labor, they have higher environmental controls, they have all these, things that go with hiring the people who live in those countries. And so you tend to see where that's been successful. You see a lot of things like automation that come into it, so that the amount of value that the company derives from each individual worker is higher and matches the value that that person generates doing services work. You don't see developed countries go to things like assembly lines, or one of the things that people used as an example is trying to onshore manufacturing things like clothing from Vietnam. And for an American worker who, I forget what the average is right now, but say it's $80,000 a year, each individual worker in that factory has to count for a ton of t-shirts to pay them $80,000.
That'll seep into inflation as well. Ultimately,
right?
You basically,
that they have to, if we model that out really quickly and say, okay, you want to get $1 out of each t-shirt for the worker, it's okay, what sort of equipment, what does a factory look like that allows an individual, for each person who works there, we need 100,000 t-shirts to come out. And so you go, okay, we're going to have a small factory that's, say, only about 100 people, and it's supposed to make 1 million of them a year to pay those 100 people. We didn't make that many jobs. The level of productivity that's required in a developed country to pay those workers is just massive. And I think that's why you see things like cars, aircraft. There's a lot of US manufacturing in industries like oil and gas where the equipment involved is really expensive. And so you can spread the cost of your workers over a smaller number of units.
I think
or their tasks that lend themselves to automation.
I think a smaller scale story, and it's the service sector, it's not manufacturing, but when we're talking about sudden price increases and consumer reactions and cost of labor and things like that, that I'm based in the DC area, and a few years ago, DC passed a ballot initiative known as Initiative 82 I-82, which overtime gets rid of the tipped wage in DC. And currently the DC minimum wage is $17.50 an hour. This summer it goes to $17.95. And so over time, the restaurants in DC and won't be able to pay out at the they won't be able to take a tip credit on wages. And that's led to most restaurants here in the area implementing a service charge. Some have kept that around 6 to 8%. Some have made that 20 to 25%. And sometimes that's going directly to workers. Sometimes that's kind of just going into a general operating fund, but it's helping pay the increased wages because they're still taking partial tip credits. But
Right. Well,
a
and
couple weeks
consumers are
ago,
more amenable
yeah,
to, you know, having that as a, okay, we, charge 10% more because we have to pay our workers more. Being explicit that way rather than just, okay, my menu
Yeah.
items just cost 10% more.
yeah, I mean, and yeah, so instead of raising